Good morning, everybody. Dr. Pete here, and I decided to do a pop-up live event this morning because I recently published a video that was based on a talk that I gave at the Collaborative Science Conference that was put together by Dave Feldman, mainly centered around the lipid energy model, but it included a massive variety of different speakers on different topics. And it was a very refreshing conference because of the different opinions and viewpoints and stories from the people. Anyway, I published this Polyl-Fructose-Uric Acid video I think it was the day before yesterday, and I've had an amazing amount of questions that were posted, and I decided to do this pop-up this morning, and I took the top 4 questions. So before we get started with that, I think it's important for you guys to understand my story. I'm a PhD biochemist. I am a biochemical analyst. 6 years ago, I was diagnosed with prediabetes, and I also was a gout sufferer at that point. And I wanted to do something about that condition. And to make a long story short, I came into the low carb environment. I found my way here because I saw a video by Dr. Sarah Hallberg. And when I went into the literature, I found my way to the papers that Verta had published. And then that started literally a journey into everything that I could learn in the peer-reviewed, published biochemical literature that has taken me back even into the mid-1700s. And as a gout sufferer, I wanted to understand what was going on with that and the uric acid issue as I went into a ketogenic lifestyle, which I've lived for 6 years. And I did reverse my prediabetes very quickly, and my gout is in remission. And like Feldman, for example, I have done, we have different routes that we've chosen for this, but I've done a lot of N1. And in any case, the study of gout led me to Dr. Richard Johnson's work, which numbers over 700 publications and decades of work. And then from there into other collaborators of his, and then to other people that are unrelated, but same sort of subject area. And in the study of gout and uric acid, this led me to something that is at the center of my interest, which is trying to understand what the metabolic pathways are that underlie all metabolic disease. And honestly, I think that we found our way there. I think that fructose uric acid metabolism explains most, if not all, metabolic disease. And the last couple of videos that I put on my YouTube channel are grappling with that issue. And I think we need to wrap our heads around this. And the reason that we do, and I get a lot of criticisms for this, that I'm too technical, that I go to the science in too hardcore of a way, and that I'm not understandable. And, here's the thing. We need to understand the science. In fact, I've even been told this by some of the practitioners, why do we need to know this? We know that the ketogenic diet works. And honestly, people, the reason we need to know this, the reason we need to keep pushing is because we need to understand better what drives our metabolism, at the very least, so that we can modify our lifestyle and be healthier, right? For all the obvious reasons, not only things that are financial, but for me, and more to the point, for those of us that are aging out of our culture, right? I'm over 60 now. I'm 65 years old. I'm going to be 66 in 2 months. I have a grandson. What do the next 30 years look like? What do you want out of the next 30 years? All right. So with that introduction, then let's move very quickly into this, because I don't intend for this presentation to be super long this morning. And I've got some slides, so let's just let them lead us through this. First off, this question of aging in our population is really a big deal. Close to 15% are type 2 diabetic. When we get to 60 years old and older, which very quickly, look what the demographics are in our culture right now. We're an older population, and most of us are sick with metabolic diseases, in denial about it, nevertheless sick. 15% almost type 2 diabetic. And then look at the pre-diabetic. I was in that classification 6 years ago, 38%. When you combine those two statistics together, the type 2s and the pre-diabetics, that's pretty shocking how many of us, as we go into our older age, are suffering from diabetic comorbidities that don't bode well for getting old, right? What does that look like down the road, right? What does that look like when you get into your 70s? Just think about that for a minute. And then we have the obesity thing. Oh my God, watch the national news. And even Oprah had a thing the other night, right? And what's the rage about this? Number one, we're not allowed to talk about it, right? Number two, go ahead and take something like Wegovy or Ozempic at $1,000 to $1,300 a month. Yeah, sure, go ahead. And the insurance companies aren't willing to fund it. And think about the consequences of them funding it. We already have health care costs that are outrageous, right? I don't want to go to the doctor anymore, right? Why? Because you go there and then you find out that this and that are not covered, and why is that going on? It's because there's so many people now, so many in our age group that are suffering from metabolic diseases, and the insurance companies don't want to pay for it. So they find ways of not paying for it. And they don't pay for these obesity drugs, right? And I'm going to cuss. The sorry ass thing about it is that there is a way to lose that weight in a lifestyle which is invigorating, the food tastes great, and you don't have to diet. You don't have to cut the calories, and you don't need the Ozempic or the Wegovy, right? But did this even come up the other night on the Oprah special? No. They marched all these experts across the stage and every other darn thing, and nobody even talked about the low carb lifestyle, even though our data now, which lists in hundreds of publications going all the way back, right? If you've done your research, if you've read the history of this right now, I don't mean the popular books that have come out. I'm talking about actually going and seeing the research. This way of eating, this lifestyle, and the power of it and what it can do has been known for a really long time. It's just utterly ridiculous. And then look at the statistics for cardiovascular disease, right? That's shocking. There's nobody, certainly when I think about my extended family, there's more than one individual in my extended family. And in fact, there are a few individuals that are just super sick with cardiovascular issues. Unbelievable. And the numbers of gout sufferers, everyone knows who listens to me that I'm a specialist in that area, is up, right? We're at 12 million people, about 4.68% of our population is suffering from gout. And even more, 20% are hyperuricemic. That means they're walking around with high uric acid, of which we have to be careful about this, right? But there's a lot of there's a massive body of associational data that shows the connection to cardiovascular disease with this issue. And then the chronic kidney disease load. And then when we go to the gout sufferers, this is for all of you guys that follow me relative for putting gout in remission. You see that if you suffer from gout, the chances that you also have other comorbidities is really good. I mean, the likelihood that you're not suffering from something else is really slim. And the reason for this is because metabolic disease is systemic, and it is being driven by a central metabolic mechanism. And that means that for those of us that are susceptible to this, that we are going to usually suffer from other comorbidities besides the one thing that we think that we're suffering from. And for gout sufferers, most of us are also or have high blood pressure. I know I did. And over half are obese, and a full quarter are also diabetic, right? Those were my choice uh, um, combinations, right? I was pre-diabetic and suffering from gout. And probably, I think now, over the last 6 years, I think I also was suffering from kidney issues, right? This is very common. 24% of us kidney stones, and between 10 to 14% have or are suffering from cardiovascular diseases, including stroke and heart attack. Now let's get into this. Question number one I got the other day from the Polyl-Fructose-Uric acid metabolism, which I have argued is, if it isn't the central, it is one of the central mechanisms that explains all metabolic diseases. All right. So this question, is the polyl-fructose-uric acid pathway only active in metabolically sick people? And the answer is no. This pathway is evolutionarily conserved in humans and evolutionarily conserved in all animals from yeast through humans. It's something all of us do. And we can go back into the evolutionary evidence for this. There was a time point where our human ancestors were almost eating exclusively fruit, right? And from that came the biochemical pathways to metabolize fructose. At the same time, our capabilities to metabolize glucose, and the importance of understanding the polyol pathway, which is ubiquitous throughout our organs, right? And slowly I'm going to be publishing this, hopefully with some other authors. But I have looked at extensively in the literature, starting with the intestinal system, then the pancreas, then the liver, and then all of the peripheral organs that are south of the liver, right? Including the brain. And the brain is really an important organ to be looking at because of its energy requirements and the fact that there is evidence that polyl-fructose-uric acid metabolism is driving Alzheimer's and dementia and other Parkinson's, for example. There's a component there. And then also look at all of the evidence that has been coming out, and people are now talking about the diseases surrounding the brain, right? Bipolar, all these different things, depression, all these different things, they have strong linkages back to how the brain is modulating energy, right? And to the mitochondria, which there's a lot here. So the polyl-fructose-uric acid metabolism is the way that humans in general flexibly store fat and glycogen. We have an elevation in systemic inflammation that is stimulating the immune system, and we alter the nitric oxide signaling mechanisms to alter blood pressure. This is a survival mechanism, right? And in our ancestors, this pathway was meant to be activated in a very powerful way when we came in contact with food supplies, which we could very efficiently convert into fat. And why would we want to do that? Because we were only activating this pathway intermittently. And then we were using the stored energy resources to go out and get more food. That's what we were doing. Now in our culture, right, where people are eating literally 5 to 6 times a day, pretty much snacking all day long, and eating foods in particular that are centered on glucose and fructose, we're spending most of our day in this elevated storage condition versus the burning condition, right? And I'm arguing now that we actually exist in different metabolic states. We shift from one state to another. And most people in the US are in the storage state, which has the systemic inflammation and also the alteration in nitric oxide signaling, which translates to elevated blood pressure, they're spending the vast majority of the 24-hour period of a day in that state and very little time in the burning state. For those of us that eat in the low carb lifestyle, and I'm talking about this in a general way right now, because I know there's lots of different ways you can go with this. We spend the majority of our day in the burning state, and we spend very little of our time in this inflammatory state or in the storage state, which ancestrally was a good place to be. And that's why you see the effect of this way of eating beneficial for so many things, because of where we're spending the majority of our time, right? That's a really important concept here. Question 2, why does the glucose activation threshold seem low? All right, now for some of you that are listening to this, you're going to go, oh, all right, what's this guy talking about? And if you saw the talk, if you actually were at the conference that I went to and you saw me talk about this, and then the last 2 videos that I put on my YouTube channel, I've talked about the activation of this pathway being somewhere above about 90 mg per deciliter. And some of you have come back and go, wow, that seems really low to me. So here's the first thing you got to understand about my choice of threshold. So number one, I'm going to put out there right now, we actually don't know what the threshold is. And I've been asking this question now for a while. What is the threshold required to have this change in state from the burning state, where our energy is going into the mitochondria and is being utilized to produce energy that we then turn around and we burn, right? That's the burning state, versus the storage state, where basically everything that's coming in is being put away as fat. We're topping off glycogen, which once the glycogen is topped off, think about that, people, and you're sitting in an office chair all day long with no activity, right? And then you're eating again. Well, there is no more glycogen to store because you already did it when you had breakfast that morning, right? Basically, everything that's coming in at that point is being pushed off into fat storage. So the question becomes, how do we activate that pathway? What's required to do that? Well, the normal way that we think about glucose, right, when we look in the literature or we listen to influencers and all of this business, is we talk about, all right, well, glucose, the normal fasting glucose should be somewhere between 69 or 70, depending on the laboratory where you're getting your blood drawn, and 99, right? They're talking about circulatory glucose levels at certain times when you measure them. I'm asking a different question. I'm asking, okay, in the liver, right? If we focus on the liver right now, and obviously there's, maybe not obviously, but we have all these organs, and polyl-fructose-uric acid metabolism is in all of them, but albeit expression levels are different, and the outcome of those expressions are tissue specific. So let's just talk about the liver right now. And you have glucose coming into the liver. I'm asking the question, what concentration of glucose is required to activate polyl-fructose-uric acid? And to answer that question, what I did was I went to the literature and I asked another question, which was, what level of glucose is required to specifically activate the enzymes that activate this pathway? Biochemically, in a test tube, what is the known concentration of glucose to activate aldose reductase? And what about glucokinase? Is there a relationship with that enzyme? And when you look at the biochemical evidence, that is actually quite good and been published back in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s, we find out 2 things. One, aldose reductase has a range of glucose under which it's activated, which goes between 0.9 millimolar. I'm going to use some language now, sorry, but this is the way it is, between 0.9 millimolar and 9 millimolar. And then when you look at glucokinase and you ask the same question, it is activated under glucose concentrations between 5 and 7 millimolar. Coincidence? Maybe. Glucokinase is also activated under micromolar concentrations of the products of polyl-fructose-uric acid metabolism. Sorbitol, fructose, which is produced endogenously right in the liver, and also fructose 1-phosphate, the very first substrate that is produced when fructokinase is operating on the endogenous fructose. The amount of the fructose products required to activate glucokinase is 1,000-fold less than the amount of glucose. Okay, so right now, when you look at that evidence, it's too good evidence. When we start to talk about coincidental, or now the coincidences are really starting to be racked up. And I don't think that, I think it's enough coincidences to ask the next question, which is, okay, guys, it's time to get back into the in vitro, in vivo work and start to really push on this. And there hasn't been enough of that research. So here's what I think about the glucose threshold to activate polyl-fructose-uric acid. I think that the threshold is a lot lower than we think. What is the threshold exactly? I don't know. What I do know is that we need to know a lot more about the relationship of glucokinase, aldose reductase, fructokinase, which is sitting there at the committed irreversible step of fructose-uric acid metabolism, and the enzyme phosphofructokinase 1, which is sitting on the other side of that relationship that catalyzes the irreversible commitment to glycolysis, the burning type of glycolysis, right? We need to know a lot more about that. In fact, we need to know a lot more basic, hardcore biochemistry of our metabolism. We are, in a good way, when we think about Feldman pushing in from the outside of the forest, we need to start pushing out towards the edge of the forest from the inside. We need a lot more hardcore biochemical metabolic work than we have right now. And the reason we do is because we need to understand how these pathways are working together. This is like one of the issues with how biochemistry of metabolism is taught in our schools, right? It's taught as individual pathways. And when you ask a teacher or a professor, how are these things connected? You're going to get a blank stare because they haven't thought about it. Glycolysis is taught, the oxidation phosphorylation pathways within the mitochondria and the matrix pathways like beta oxidation. Those things are taught as individual pathways. And when you start to ask these guys about, okay, well, how does this pathway relate to this pathway over there? It's like, I don't know. And we talk about, okay, under normal glucose concentrations, think about that for a minute. What the hell is a normal glucose concentration? Think about that, right? Because I'm starting to push on that idea a lot. And I would contend to you that we don't know. I would say we have these metabolic pathways, polyl-fructose-uric acid, which I think is so important to us. You can't even think about it, right? It's overwhelming to me when I think about how important this is to us. What does it take to activate that, right? And what is normal glucose relative to that? And these are valid, very valid questions to be asking. Question number 3. Okay, and I have no interest, people, behind this question or above it. I want you guys to understand as an influencer that I am not interested in being part of the food wars. I think they're silly. That's what I think about that. Now, the nature of this question wasn't coming from that place, but I want to point that out right now because we hear this question asked for other reasons out there. Now, the reason why this is important, and it was a really, really good question that I was asked, has to do with, okay, glucose seems to be fundamental to our biology. So is fructose, by the way. It's fundamental to our biology, but glucose is fundamental. And this threshold question, which seems low, why would that be? Because our ancient ancestors ate carbohydrates and they weren't getting sick. I totally agree with that. I mean, I've done my homework. I study this stuff, right? I've read everything I can get my hands on in regard to this, and I'm talking about peer-reviewed publications. I'm not talking about the yin and the yang type hand-waving stuff that we see in the superficial, popular publications. I have no argument about this. Ancient populations did eat carbohydrates, right? But there's a couple things we need to keep in mind about that. If we go out, like in the mountains, I have a mountaineering background. I learned to climb in the mountains when I was a kid, and I taught survival for years in my late teens through my early 20s. And so I have a perspective about this, and that is biased because I've had to go out and live off the land before in an environment that's fairly well hostile to that. And so I have some things to say about this. I think when you look at ancient populations, did they eat carbohydrates? Hell yeah, they ate them. But have you ever looked at the difference between a strawberry that you're going to find or a blueberry that you're going to find on a bush in late August up in the mountains compared to what they're selling in the stores? There's really the difference is astounding, starting with size and then the sourness, right? Significantly less fructose in the berries you're going to find in the mountains or in places where they normally grow compared to what we see in our supermarkets. So the first thing is that there's really a massive difference between, the food that we buy in terms of how it's been manipulated and whatnot. Fruit, for one, just the size and the level of fructose. These things have been bred now for sweetness. It's really different, right? The carbohydrates that these guys were getting out of the ground are significantly different than what we're getting when we buy these things in the store. And then please consider how often. I'm not talking about how often I eat. I'm talking about how often the standard American is eating over the course of the day and what that content looks like. The level of glucose coming in is really different than it was back then. That's number one. And then number two is the workload. There's no comparison to the workload that the standard American is utilizing every single day or putting out every single day throughout their day, right? This isn't just a remarkable difference. It's a stunning difference, and these guys were busting their asses back then to get their food. And there were times when they went out the door to work for it that they came home with barely anything, if anything at all, right? And I've experienced that myself, right? It was like feast or famine. There were days when we were working up in the mountains to get food where we were very successful, right? And we ate relatively well, right? And I say relative because if you knew what we were eating at the time and saw the amounts compared to what people sit down and eat now, you go, wow, okay, he said that they did pretty well. Yeah, okay, that's living off the land. It's different. And then there were days where we just went all day long with nothing. All the animals that we chased down got away. The fish weren't biting. The stuff that we were digging out, again, this is about the carbohydrates. We're digging these tubers out of the ground. They were little and covered with dirt. And the other side of this coin is the things are seasonal. I mentioned the fact that the berries, for example, they're in August. If you're in a mountainous or an alpine environment in June, there are no berries at that point. You're not going to get any berries at that point. And then there are things that aren't even coming out of the ground yet. right? So there's a real seasonal aspect to this thing. So, what we're talking about here is people sitting down and eating in a way that would stimulate these pathways. And our pathways are super sensitive to this. That was a necessity of human survival, right? And when you look at other organisms, right, even simple pond organisms, they have very directed ways when they get on a food source. They sit on the food source and they take that food source in, converting the incoming macronutrients into fat until the food source is gone. Then they move on. And they have signaling mechanisms that allow them to move around until that allow them to find the next food source. And what are they burning in the interim? They're burning all that fat that they stored, right? And glycogen and things like that, right? They are using up what they stored when they were sitting on the food supply. And humans, we have our mechanism to do the same thing. Where we're getting into trouble is when we shift from the burning state, the utilization of energy, into the storage state that is characterized by high inflammation and an alteration in our blood pressure and the way our cardiovascular system functions, and sitting in that spot indefinitely. That's where we're getting into trouble. And one last thing I'm going to say here before going to the next question is that we want to not be in that state. The Polyl-Fructose-Uric acid metabolism and insulin resistance, which is this thing I'm going to go to last, these are perfectly functional states that we want to be in, right? But we were never meant to be there indefinitely. And it's the indefinite nature of this drive that puts us in this state that when we do it for decade after decade after decade is what's driving these diseases. And the constellation of what you end up with is a function of your global genetics. That's why we all show up with different things. And some of us are resilient. I'm not making an argument that everyone's going to get sick, but most of us are getting sick when you look at the statistics. Okay, last but not least, is insulin resistance pathological? All right, please think about this for a minute. All right, insulin has a lot of functions in the human body, but one of the functions is that it's a fat storage hormone, and I don't have any problem with that. When you step back from this and you think about, all right, fructose-uric acid metabolism actually drives insulin resistance. That I talked about that in the last two talks that I've posted on my YouTube channel. So the question is why? Now, think about this for a minute. When we start taking in these macronutrients, what is one of the functions of insulin? It's to direct the glucose around. We have all these different organs, and they all have different functions that are tissue specific. The kidney is not the heart, and the heart is not the brain, right? And the brain, coming back to that, is you might argue in a human. I kind of have an issue with this really, but if it's not the most important organ, it ranks up there, right? I think these guys have sort of equivalent, they have equivalent importances, but we know that if we lose the brain, right, you're going to die, period. And the point is that the insulin is helping, or you might argue is one of the main drivers of making sure the glucose gets where it needs to go. So insulin resistance is a normal function of the human being. But like I said in the last slide, the issue here is keeping yourself in an insulin resistant state indefinitely. How can that be good for us? It's not, right? And that's why you see this fundamental issue, insulin resistance, being a central component in all these metabolic diseases. So insulin resistance is fundamental to our survival, but it's also becomes pathological. And so does polyl-fructose-uric acid metabolism becomes pathological when it is elevated and when we maintain that metabolic state indefinitely. All right. So the whole point is really, when it boils down to it, is keep the carbs low. Down the road we go. All right. Now, I'd like to thank you for your attention this morning. I hope that you learned something from this. And this is my contact information here. I also put it in my notes. All right. Now I'm going to just glance very quickly at the questions that I have in the chat here. All right, these guys are coming in, and a couple comments here that one from Steve Rutledge about the fact that he has successfully made a transformation into this lifestyle and is doing really well with it. And we see also coming in from the Pete Homestead, another Pete out there. And he is law enforcement, and he's talking about how many code blues that they go to. Yeah, there's just so much of this going on, and that's why I'm here, is because I'm trying to make a difference. So anyway, you guys have a really good weekend, and thanks for the comments and the questions, and I'll see you guys next time.